Good evening. My name is Chris Arnold, and on behalf of the Bob and Alicia Woodrick Diversity Learning Center at Grand Rapids Community College, we are pleased to have you here tonight as we kick off our 13th annual Diversity Lecture Series. I'd like to just take a quick moment to acknowledge one of our Board of Trustees members who's here with us tonight. And our Board of Trustees members work very hard for our college and our community and are very supportive of our diversity initiatives here. So Mr. Richard Verberg. And I'd also like to take a moment just to acknowledge our generous sponsors of the lecture series. So we could not do the lecture series without the support of our sponsors. Our champion sponsors include Spectrum Health and Warner Norcross and Judd and the Nokomis Foundation. Diversity Partners, Altacor, and we have many diversity supporters which are listed in your program. And for those of you who have expressed an interest in supporting some of our programs through the Diversity Center, we have opportunities for that through our foundation, and there are envelopes on the tables out in the lobby as well as a donation container. So please feel free to make a donation if you wish. And I'd like to just take a moment, too, to acknowledge our diversity team at the college and to thank them for their hard work and continuous support for our efforts. And a special thank you to Jennifer Smith and to Kathleen Owens for their day-to-day support in the Diversity Center, and for all the volunteers who are here tonight. And really would like to extend a warm thank you to Fountain Street Church for hosting us here tonight in this wonderful facility. Parking, for those of you who parked in one of the GRCC ramps, parking passes are available in the lobby, and they're blue passes. And then please, your opinion is very valuable to us, so if you could please take a moment to fill out your evaluation, we would really appreciate that. Okay, and I guess I can't imagine a time when the need for honest, open communication about culture and diversity is needed more than it is needed now today. And I know I mentioned our sponsors, and now I am very pleased to introduce Mr. Rodney Martin, who is a diversity partner with Warner Norcross and Judd, and we do very much appreciate the support of our sponsors. So I would like to bring him to the podium, and he will introduce our honored speaker tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and let me add my welcome to the Diversity Lecture Series. We are so proud once again to be able to be a sponsor of this extraordinary lecture series. I'm also proud because it's a distinct honor that I have tonight to introduce to you one of the nation's preeminent lecturers and authors on the subject of immigrant origin children and globalization, Dr. Marcelo Suarez Orozco. Dr. Suarez Orozco is the Courtney Sale Ross University Professor of Globalization and Education at New York University and is a co-founder of the Harvard Immigration Project, which studies the impact of immigrant students on the American educational system and issues of adaptation as they affect immigrant children. Dr. Suarez Orozco is the author of scores of books and scholarly articles regarding the subject. His new book, Learning in a New Land, or about to come out book, Learning in a New Land, Immigrant Students in American Society, is based on an extraordinary study that followed 400 newly arrived children from the Caribbean, China, Central America, and Mexico for 5 years. Dr. Suarez Orozco believes that how these children adapt to the education system will determine the nature of America in the 21st century. The winner of the 2008, and that's right, 2008, Stone Award for Best Book on Education, Learning in a New Land provides a compelling account of the lives, dreams, ironies, and frustration of these youngest immigrants. A much sought-after speaker, Dr. Suarez Orozco, has addressed the United Nations Secretary General's first annual Global Colloquium of University Presidents and delivered a high-profile keynote on globalization, immigration, and Education for the Mexican Foreign Minister and the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He has also been a visiting professor of psychology at the University of Barcelona in Spain and a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Immigrant origin children are now the fastest growing sector of the child population in many advanced post-industrial societies. In the U.S., for example, 1 in 5 children originate in immigrant-headed homes. How should these children be educated to become productive and engaged citizens in their societies? Should they be encouraged to assimilate or to maintain their cultural traditions? What about bilingual education? Tonight's presentation, Immigration and the Future of Education, will explore the answers to those and many other questions. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to tonight's featured speaker, New York University's Dr. Marcelo Suarez Orozco.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin. I'm extremely moved by your warm welcome. It's the kind of introduction that my father would have liked and my mother would have believed. It's a great pleasure to be back in Grand Rapids, and I'm delighted to thank Mr. Martin, Ms. Arnold, the Woodrick family, the Grand Rapids Community College, and the Fountain Street Church, where I'm delighted to share with you this evening some of the conceptual, some of the analytical, and some of the empirical research we have been doing in this area of large-scale migration and the adaptation of immigrant origin children. It is a great pleasure. I'm delighted to share with you the fruits of our research. I'd like to start with a reflection on the unprecedented demographic changes taking place in the world today. We are now in the middle of the largest migratory wave in human history. Today, we estimate that between 185 and 200 million people are living beyond the borders of their countries of birth. If we reflect upon those who leave and the immediate family members that remain behind, what we have today is probably approximately 500 million people that are affected by large-scale migration, either as migrants themselves or as the relatives of those left behind. Another way to think about this is if you add all of the migrants and their relatives left behind, only China and India today have more people than this third migrant nation. International migrants are a fast-growing sector of democracies in both the developing and the developed world. Today, we estimate that immigrants are sending home in excess of $300 billion. That's roughly 3 times the combined total of all OECD countries. Those are the wealthy, advanced, post-industrial democracies in the world. All of the combined foreign aid is roughly 1/3 of what immigrants are remitting back home today. This is a phenomenon that is transforming our country, but it is transforming the entire world. Leicester in England, for example, is going to be the first European city with a non-white majority population. In our country, we already have many states, many counties that are already minority-majority states and counties. I recently came back from a lecture at the German Foreign Office. Chancellor Merkel was there. I learned that Frankfurt today has 30% of its population is immigrant. Rotterdam, the largest port in the heart of Europe, today is 45% immigrant. Amsterdam is going to be half immigrant in less than one generation. Sweden, a very fascinating country, because Sweden sent 100 years ago, about 1 million Swedes came to the United States. Today, Sweden has about 1 million immigrants in its country. In fact, the ratio of immigration in Stockholm today, roughly 40% of all children in the Stockholm schools come from immigrant origin homes. And that is the tip of the iceberg. China alone today has in excess of 150 million migrants. More children in China are affected by immigration than there are people in Canada. Roughly 40 million children are on the move, either as migrants or as the children of migrants who are left behind. So this is not a Michigan issue, a New York issue, a California issue. This is an issue that defines the world moving forward. The world today is facing the age of migration. Next, please. In fact, when we reflect upon the worldwide data, it is important to keep in mind that while the movement of people from the southern hemisphere into the wealthier centers of the world is one of the chapters in a much, much more complicated book, which today is rewriting how we think about immigration. Immigration today involves every region of the world: Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas are being transformed by large-scale immigration. So when we think about immigration in our country, we tend to look at the United States through the lens of exceptionalism. We are unlike many other countries because, other than the native peoples, every churn in the history of the making of the United States has immigration right at its core. Whether it's the explorations 500 years ago from the European explorers, whether it was the great involuntary movement of millions of African slaves, a kind of involuntary migration, whether it's the great transatlantic movement of people, which in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars into the first decade of the 20th century saw 50 million Europeans come to the New World, or this new wave of immigration, the topic of tonight's reflection. Immigration has defined the nature, history, and character of our country. In our country, immigration is both history, but as I'm going to share with you tonight, it is the destiny of our country moving forward. Next, please. Today, we estimate that over 36 million Americans are foreign-born, that is, people born in Mexico, born in the Dominican Republic, born in Ghana, who migrate to the United States. If we combine the foreign-born population with the first U.S.-born, that is, immigrants and the children of immigrants, over 70 million Americans today, are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. This is the largest number in the history of our country, but it is, in terms of proportion, not as high as in previous eras of large-scale migration. Next. This is part of a worldwide dynamic. And in fact, when immigration mobilizes anxiety, immigration mobilizes concern, immigration mobilizes fundamental questions about the future character of our society, we need to pause and reflect. Today, in terms of global migratory patterns, the United States is not leading the way in terms of the proportion, the rate of immigrants to the native-born population. In fact, many other wealthy, advanced post-industrial democracies today have rates of immigration that are much higher than the United States. Australia has a rate of immigration that is almost double the US rate. Switzerland, Canada, even Germany, a country which until very, very recently did not consider itself a country of immigration, today Germany's rate of immigration is higher than our rate of immigration. So this, I think, helps us frame the issue of immigration in the context of deep historical and comparative dynamics where, in a way, all societies are dealing with very, very similar sorts of issues. Next. In fact, moving forward, the great irony is our country, as well as the wealthy OECD countries of the North, will all be facing a future where immigration will once again be fundamental for the economic well-being, especially as rapidly aging societies. Certainly the case in countries like Germany, in countries like Spain, in countries like Italy, in countries like Japan, societies that are at once rapidly aging and societies that have below replacement fertility rates will find it extremely difficult to maintain current levels of economic development without a major new immigration initiative. These are the OECD countries, and what these data show is that without migration, you will have a gap of roughly 100 million people in terms of what the economies will need to maintain current levels of economic output. And this is, of course, immensely paradoxical. I just mentioned that in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars into the first decade of the 20th century, 50 to 70 million Europeans came to the New World. That's the number now, 100 million new immigrants that are going to be needed if these advanced democracies are to maintain their current demographic momentum. Next. Of course, as I said, our country, unlike countries like Germany or Sweden or the Netherlands, is a country where immigration has been a part of our history, and it will fundamentally remain an axis that will structure American identity and American society and economy moving forward. These are U.S. Bureau of the Census data that show, I think, with breathtaking clarity what we're in the process of in terms of an unprecedented demographic shift. The United States will, in 2 generations, be the only advanced post-industrial democracy in the world where half of our population will be members of so-called racially, ethnically marked minority groups. This fundamentally challenges the notion of minorities and majorities when we're looking at a future where very important sectors of our population will be people of color. Next. But this is driven, of course, by a demographic momentum that is in fundamental ways already decoupled from migratory policies and from migratory processes. Because the growth in terms of the immigrant origin population of the United States today is taking place in the 2nd generation and beyond. Today, 1 in 5 children in our country is the child of immigrants. It will be 1 in 3 within a generation. It is indeed the fastest growing sector of the U.S. child population. Let me give you an example. 1 out of every 6 babies born today is born to a Hispanic mother. We are told by the statisticians at the U.S. Bureau of the Census, who develop extremely sophisticated models to track the number of Americans every day born in our country, that precisely on October 17th, 2006, at 7:46 in the morning, the 300 million American was born. The models developed by the statisticians at the U.S. Bureau of the Census suggest that this child was most likely born in what is now our second largest city, and it is part of the great demographic shift away from the Northeast into the Southwest of the United States. The child, we're told, was most likely born in Los Angeles, California, at 7:46 in the morning. The child was most likely the child of Mexican immigrants. It is most probable, the statisticians argue, that the child was baptized if he was a boy, and remember, every day slightly more boys than girls are born in our country. If the baby was a boy, he was most likely baptized with the name Jose. If the baby was a girl, she would have been baptized with what is now the most common name for newborn baby girls in the state of California, Maria. Jose and Maria are the future of the United States. Next. Because our country is undergoing a profound shift. This is the age-sex pyramid for the non-Hispanic white population of the United States. What these data show is that in the next generation, roughly 70 million baby boomers will be entering their demographic winter, will move into retirement, and they will move away from productivity in the labor market into the retirement years. 70 million people, the vast majority of them of white European origin. Next. This is the age-sex pyramid for the foreign-born Hispanic population of the United States. By far the fastest-growing sector of our population and the engine that has driven immigration over the last decade. It is the Latinization of the U.S. migration flow that characterizes our current immigration dynamic. And this data reveal exactly what you would expect, knowing the sociological framework that drives migration worldwide today. Very few old people migrate, very few young people migrate. Immigrants tend to migrate and cluster around very specific age groupings. Next. This is the future of the United States. This is the age-sex pyramid for the native-born Hispanic origin population of the United States. This is Jose and Maria. This is the fastest-growing sector of our population. This is the future of American economy. This is the future of American society. This is what's driving the changes taking place in the United States today. You have a rapidly aging white European origin population, and you have a rapidly growing Hispanic origin population that will characterize the future of our country in the decades to come. Next. But what we're seeing today is much, much more complicated than simply that. We live in an age of hyperdiversity. Immigrants in our country today are more diverse than ever before in the history of the United States. I wake up in a city, I take the subway to work every morning, in a city where children from approximately 190 different countries get up, get in buses, get in the subway, get in the train to go to schools. That never happened before in the history of humanity. Never before in human history did one city contain the entire world. Every region of the world, every language, every culture is represented in any of our cosmopolitan cities today. Immigrants indeed are hyper-diverse. Very difficult to generalize about immigrants in the United States. If you look at economic background, immigrants today are much more diverse than ever before in the history of immigration to our country. Some are among the most educated and affluent people in the United States. Kofi Annan told me recently there are now more doctors from Ghana in New York State than there are doctors in Ghana, to give you a sense of just how we are attracting some of the most highly skilled, some of the most highly educated people worldwide. The immigrant origin population of the United States is overrepresented in the category of winners of the Nobel Prize for the United States. It's overrepresented in the category of deans at Harvard University, tenure professors, scientists, winners of the Intel Award competitions, and so on and so forth. At the same time, of course, large numbers of new immigrants have limited levels of education and are considered part of the working poor. In terms of linguistic background, never in the history of our country have we witnessed the kind of diversity we see today. 100 years ago, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, maybe a dozen world languages dominated the neighborhoods. Today, the diversity in terms of language and culture is simply breathtaking. Over 90 different languages are spoken in the Los Angeles schools today. What then do we know about how we fare in easing the transition to citizenship, to belonging to the labor market amongst the children of immigrants? Like in terms of the general background of their parents and their families, it is very difficult to generalize. For many immigrant children today, it is the best of times. For many other children, it is the worst of times. And this then brings us to the topic of education. Next. Education will be much more relevant in the transition of the immigrant origin population of the United States to the labor market, to citizenship, and to belonging, that was the case 100 years ago when millions of poorly educated, really mostly largely illiterate peasants from Europe were coming to the United States in huge numbers. 100 years ago, it was really the industrial moment. It was really the Fordist revolution that eased the transition of huge numbers of European origin immigrants who, through floor shop mobility, with very little levels of formal education, were able, over time and across generations, to eventually reach a middle-class standard of living in our economy. This wave of immigration is facing a very, very different global economic and social landscape. Education today will be the most important mechanism mediating the long-term outcomes of this largest wave of immigration since the turn of the last century. This is part of a worldwide pattern, a worldwide phenomenon. Education today is more important than ever before in human history. It is for the first time in human history a normative ideal. Every region of the world today expects children to be formally educated in formal institutions devoted to the inculcation of skills, sensibilities, practical knowledge that will enable the next generation to carry forward. The data are overwhelming. Each additional year of school is associated worldwide among immigrants and among native students with tremendously powerful long-term virtuous cycles, including lower fertility, including increased health, including status mobility and financial well-being. the return to educations worldwide continue to grow at a breathtaking pace. The problems of the 21st century, moving forward from environmental degradation to deep poverty to terrorism, do not respect the boundaries of nation states and require much, much more coordinated, smarter global solutions, demanding more of education than ever before. Next, returns to education are continue to grow. This slide shows the relative decline in the position of the United States in terms of college graduation rates. This is a cautionary tale as how the global economy is shifting the kinds of processes that are mediating better outcomes in terms of the educational adaptation of the growing youth and child population. We went from second in the year 1996 to 15th in the year 2005. These are OECD data that show a relative decline in our global standing compared to other comparable economies and societies worldwide. Next. However, the returns to education in nearly all of the advanced post-industrial democracies continue to grow at a very, very fast rate. For many, many countries now, it's in the order of between 20 and 40%, meaning that investment in education is the most profound, generates the most profound returns long-term in terms of the mobility and long-term well-being of those who are undergoing higher levels of education. Next. These are data that again show, I think you need to click it one more time, Chris, and that again show how we've slipped. This is the change in the proportion of individuals with a high school qualification equivalent. These are OECD data. These are the wealthy countries in the world. And it shows that, again, in a very, very short period of time, we went from first to 13th. Next. And amazingly, Korea went from 27th to first. If you look at the data on math achievement, science achievement, literacy achievement, comparatively, you see this relative pattern of decline over time between our country and many other wealthy post-industrial economies. Next. How then do we reflect upon what will be required in the education of the next generation? What then will be required to educate, to ease the transition of this unprecedented number of immigrant origin children through our educational system into the labor market, into citizenship, into belonging, really into the narrative of the nation? We spent the last decade at Harvard University conducting the largest study of its kind, following the lives of 400 families coming to our country from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Roughly 80% of all immigrants to the United States today originate in these three regions of the world. The book that will present the findings of this study will be released shortly by the Harvard University Press. It's called Learning a New Land, Immigrant Students in American Society. Next. Possibly the most important finding in terms of the long-term adaptation of immigrant origin students has to do with literacy and the supports that are required for the children to acquire not the conversational English, but the higher order English that will be needed to complete and to compete at the higher end of linguistic competence. It is these academic language that emerged in the context of our study as the single most and best predictor of the long-term outcomes of immigrant origin children. If you want immigrant origin children to succeed, you need to support their literacies in their home languages, which eases the transition into English, and the more the children are exposed to systematically the higher levels of English that will be required to nourish the higher order cognitive and metacognitive skills and sensibilities that will be required in the knowledge-intensive economies of the 21st centuries, the more likely you are to have children that will, in the long term, succeed. But these data and other data show simply how hard it is for immigrant origin children to acquire English proficiency at a level that qualifies them to compete academically. The yellow line is a normative bell curve. That's what you would expect in any normally distributed population. This is the normative sample. These are native children who speak English as a first language. The crimson color is the sample of immigrant origin children. You see that after 5 years in the United States, the vast majority of immigrant children are simply not ready to compete with the kinds of higher level English, academic English, that is required, for example, to deal with a time high stakes test. It simply requires 5 to 7 years of exquisitely advanced and well-structured English language classes for the children to really compete with native-born children in their second language. Next. We also discovered a paradoxical formation, which is the longer children are in our system, the more likely it is that their grades will decline, not improved. This is part of a global dynamic, and this is part of a global dynamic that is true of native origin children as well as immigrant origin children. These are the data for all the groups, except for the Chinese origin children. All of the other groups show a relative decline. The Chinese children decline slightly, but it's not statistically significant. But if you see the general pattern, is that children tend to get better grades earlier on in the system in the US, and over time their outcomes tend to decline as measured by a variety of instruments. These are grades, but we also have performance on standardized tests, for example. Next. We discover this is extremely complex statistical design. I'm not going to overwhelm you with any details. This is a Nagin's cluster analysis. It's a statistical technique that allows us to predict the individual pathway of a single individual at the beginning of the study and look at her or his trajectory over time. We identify a variety of clusters of children. We discover that approximately 14% of the children are have a low performance pattern, whether as measured by grades or performance on standardized tests. We discover that only 10% of the children improve over time. And if you pause and think, that is extremely revealing of a system that has profound difficulties in engaging immigrant origin children, especially, as I'm going to show you shortly, boys as opposed to girls. The data show that immigrant origin girls tend to outperform immigrant origin boys for every group, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of country of origin. But only 10% of the children improve over time. You would wish more children improve over time. You would wish that as children are learning more English, as they spend more time in our system, they would tend to do better. The data tend to suggest that, in fact, the opposite is true. We discover that nearly a third of the children are what we call precipitous decliners. They start relatively doing sort of in the upper end of the average scale and then decline either precipitously, and another group of about 25% of the children decline slowly. We also discover that roughly a quarter of all children start very high in the system. They arrive from overseas and they start doing very well in our schools, and they maintain a high level of performance. But if you look at the data, the normative pattern, the normative experience, statistically speaking, is one of relative decline over time, not relative improvement over time. Next. We discovered that for immigrant origin children, the quality of the schools makes a tremendous difference in the kinds of academic pathways the children will likely follow. We discovered that school quality was significantly related to academic performance. We discovered that immigrant origin children today, in many cases, are the most highly segregated children attending American schools today. Latino origin children are now more segregated than African American children in our schools. In fact, many immigrant children today face what we call a triple segregation. They face segregation by poverty, by race, and by linguistic minority status. We discovered that this has significant impact on a variety of processes that take place and shape the general ethos, the general context of a school. Their perception of safety, their general understanding of the learning environment, the quality of the curriculum, the quality of the instruction, most importantly, their exposure or lack thereof to language models when children are attending schools that are hyper-segregated, where 90% of their classmates are co-ethnics who speak the same language. Access to social capital and networks of information that are so fundamental, especially to ease the transition from primary school, secondary school, and most importantly, into tertiary school, into the world of college. Access to knowledge about college, access to the higher order skills that are necessary to thrive in the new economy are a scarcity in most of the schools that immigrant origin children today are attending. Next. Yet the data reveal that we need to nourish a school sensibility that will require, in the words of the Gates Foundation, will define the new 3 R's. That is, rigor, relevance, and relationships. Children today, immigrant origin, as well as native origin children, will need to develop the higher order cognitive and metacognitive skills needed for what my colleague Dick Murnane at Harvard and Frank Levy call expert thinking. That is, for identifying and solving problems for which there are no rule-based solutions. Moving forward, that's an irreducible skill that will remain with us in the context of the increasing hollowing out of entire sectors of the U.S. opportunity structure that will be lost to computation, will be lost to algorithmic interventions, will be lost to offshoring, will be lost to outsourcing. What will remain are the jobs that require these kinds of skills that we need to start nurturing in our children. As well, the interpersonal competencies, that is, the ability to interact, again, as Dick Murnane and Frank Levy, economists at Harvard and MIT, argue, the skills that are needed to, quote, acquire information, to explain it, to persuade others of its implications for action. But beyond these cognitive, metacognitive, and interpersonal competencies, the 21st century will be a century where cultural and linguistic sensibilities will have a huge premium, whether it's in economy, in diplomacy, or in security. Today, understanding the complexities of how culture structures identity will have fundamental repercussions for living together in a world that is ever more interconnected, yet ever more separated, paradoxically, in fundamental realms. An education for the 21st century will be an education that is cognitively engaging, that is relationally engaging, and that results in greater levels of behavior and commitment and better school performance, not only for immigrant origin children, but for all children. In the 21st century, we will need a new set of processes, and we will need to fundamentally rethink how the business of education, schooling, is conducted in the vast majority of our schools. We are going to need youth who are well-grounded in core subjects, that is, youth that develop a disciplinary understanding of how the world operates. They will need to have strong language and literacy supports. Youth are going to need to have the capacity for synthetic and interdisciplinary thinking. It is no longer necessary, it is no longer sufficient to simply master the domains of academic disciplines. Increasingly, the fundamental problems moving forward will require an interdisciplinary sensibility and the bringing together of domains that in the scholarly domain tend to be kept apart. None of the problems of the 21st century are problems that will be contained without single disciplinary domains. Whether you look at science, whether you look at the humanities, whether you look at diplomacy, whether you look at economy today, the challenges are taking place at the boundaries of fundamental disciplinary projects. We need youth to be much more globally conscious of the realities of the 21st century. We need a self-awareness that includes the ability to understand and see other cultures, and to understand and see how other cultures come to frame fundamental human problems. Critical thinking and lifelong learning skills. Education today is a lifelong project because of a fundamental dynamic. Facts become redundant at a much faster rate than ever before in human knowledge. To practice any discipline today, whether you're a physician, whether you're a businessman, whether you're a scientist, requires the constant updating of fundamental skills to remain engaged in a lifelong process that involves communication, that involves writing clearly, that involves public speaking, sharing information, and persuading others of its relevance. The 21st century will be a century where problems will be, need to be engaged in collaborative teams and will require collaborative skills, interpersonal skills and the ability to work with others who are more likely than ever before to be different from the self, who are likely to come perhaps from other religious backgrounds, from other linguistic backgrounds, from other cultural backgrounds. The education of the 21st century will require information, media, ICT literacy skills that will define how we proceed and engage with knowledge moving forward. Life skills would include leadership, adaptability, flexibility, the ability to manage ambiguity and complexity, and the ability to be personally accountable in the business of everyday life. The 21st century will mean that education will face fundamentally new challenges. The kind of education we must provide our students is very, very different from the education that define how we think about schooling in the context of the industrial era. The factory model of education for the 21st century is redundant, is irrelevant, is anachronistic to the needs of a 21st century globally integrated economy and society. New educational challenges means that we are facing students that are very, very different from the students we've encountered in previous generations. We need to understand the differences in the area of immigration between first, second, third generation students. We need to look at the point of entry of immigrant origin students into our system, and we need to understand the complexities over time and across generations that come to define the lives of immigrant families, of immigrant communities. To conclude, the 21st century will continue to witness a structural demand for immigrant origin workers. In the U.S. economy, it is driven by extremely powerful economic processes. In China, the need for immigrants is driven by the insertion of Chinese workers into the global system of capital production, consumption, and distribution of goods and services. In Europe and in Japan, because of extremely powerful and unavoidable demographic factors. Both Europe and Japan are facing a demographic winter with rapidly aging populations, below replacement fertility rates, an over-the-top social security system structure that needs a ratio of active workers to retirees that is much, much greater than the current system can maintain as I showed you in an earlier slide. This is a global phenomenon. As immigrants are summoned, often to do the impossible jobs that native workers are not interested in doing. The Japanese have a term for this. The Japanese call them the 3K jobs, for the Japanese words for dirty, dangerous, and demanding. As our economies continue to generate need for these jobs, I can guarantee you 3 decades of basic research in the field of immigration lead me to conclude that their children and families will follow. You can't have it both ways. You can't have economies that are addicted to immigrant origin labor and not understand that that labor will transform your country. We simply cannot have it both ways. Failure to properly address the realities of immigration in the global era, failing to integrate, failing to educate, failing to ease the transition of the children of immigrants will shape their long-term adaptation in our economy and society. This is critical to their future, but given the demographic predicament I outlined for you this evening, this is critical to the future of our country. Thank you very much.
If you would like to ask Dr. Orozco a question, if you could please step up to one of the mics and he will accept questions. Don't be shy.
Thank you very much for a very persuasive lecture. It appears that perhaps the most significant factor relating to success among new immigrants is the ability to learn the native tongue, and in this case it is English, and the rapidity in which one learns that native tongue is most important. It's also the case in other parts of the world. I've seen it in South Africa, for example, among the Xhosa and the Zulu who must learn English in order to acculturate and advance. Regardless, in the United States, we have 10% of these children who are succeeding compared to the 90% that are laggards. What are some of the characteristics that might be correlated with their success? Some anecdotal evidence locally seems to indicate that perhaps parochial Catholic school education is one of the factors which might be associated with some of those other factors that you were talking about. That is my question. What are some of the other factors?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and we devoted a great deal of thinking about this issue. First of all, religiosity, that is participation in religious life, is predictive of better outcomes for immigrant origin children. Catholic schools have, when you control for socioeconomic status, when you control for language, when you control for race, and any of the usual suspects in determining and structuring long-term educational achievement, tend to have better outcomes than comparable non-religious schools. So there is a powerful message here that I think we can learn and we can extrapolate from. It is often schools that have a very clear, transparent, and coherent narrative of their purpose, of their ethos, of their values, that tend to have, in the long term, the best outcomes for immigrant and native origin children alike. So what we can learn from these schools that, against the odds, tend to generate better results have to do with these fundamental orientations around values, around a coherent narrative of who are we as a school and what are our values and priorities. I think that beyond that, English language proficiency is the engine that drives the academic engagement of children. The second most important predictive factor is what we call behavioral engagement. It is doing the work of school. Why is it that Asian origin children, especially girls, tend to outperform different groups in a variety of measures? This is very, very simple. When you look at the time on task, when you look at the amount of time these kids are devoting to the work of schooling, you see a very, very powerful differentiating factor here. But what we discovered is that time on task, what we call behavioral engagement, doing the work of school, is mediated by relationships. Learning is a relational act. Whether it's 100 years of basic research in cognitive psychology, in what we now call mind, brain, and education, suggests that learning is a social process in relationship. Whether it's Vygotsky or the great Russian psychologist, or Jean Piaget, the great Swiss psychologist, or Howard Gardner in our country, learning is structured by these relationships. Relational engagement, the relationships that immigrant origin children can develop and sustain in the school context, are very predictive of how much work they end up doing. So when you do the regressions, when you develop the models for the trajectories in the long term, what you discover is that it is the kids that have more access to English. It is the kids that are spending more time doing homework. It is the kids that have more friends that speak English. And it is the kids that have more supports in schools, teachers, counselors, a church member that takes them under their wing. Those are the kids that do better against the odds. So when you when you control for socioeconomic status, when you control for a variety of indicators, most often in the lives of kids that are doing better than they should be doing, if you look at these predictive models, there is somebody, there's a mentor, somebody at the church, a coach, a volunteer, other than an immediate family member that is the transformational force in the life of that child. So it is relationships, it is basic supports, it is schools that have a coherent sense of purpose that generate better outcomes.
Thank you.
When I listen to the current political debate about immigration, I've been increasingly uncomfortable listening to political candidates talk about building fences and putting mercenary troops on the borders and denial of services to immigrants and guest passes, and all this is increasingly uncomfortable. So my question really has to do with is, how do you explain the current political climate that deals with fear of immigration, when immigrants are people that we need in our countries to do the jobs that you're describing in the 3 Ks and so on, and that the global patterns indicate that immigration is happening? How do you explain the current political climate that's so against immigration issues and the number of immigrants that are already in our borders or would like to come to our borders or are trying to get out because they're being picked up in immigration sweeps because they don't have documentation?
Yes, I've given up on trying to understand politics. I'm not smart enough for this. This requires another level of sophistication. Let me put it this way. In our country, we have been eternally ambivalent, and the political class particularly, about immigration. Immigrants, we love them, looking backwards. But we are always, in the last 150 years, has been a very powerful constant. We're always anxious, we're always afraid of immigration in the here and now. So we love immigrants when we think about the great sacrifices and achievements of the previous generations. This is a constant. 100 years ago, there was huge anxiety about the Eastern Europeans, the Jews, the Catholics coming in from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, the Italians. And the fundamental narrative of immigration then was, not unlike today, they're never going to become proud, loyal members of the American family. I was on the telephone yesterday with a reporter from the New York Times who's writing this same question that you're asking me for the Sunday edition. And I said, you know, think of it this way. 100 years ago, there was a panic over really a kind of an anti-Semitic and an anti-Catholic panic. Today, 6 members of the United States Supreme Court, 6 members of the highest court in the land, are Catholics or Jews. 100 years ago, this would have been unimaginable. When the structure of the anxiety about immigration was over, will the Italians, will the Irish, will the Eastern Europeans become Americans in the sense of the encompassing, unfolding family? So this has been a constant. The anxiety today is very, very similar to the anxiety of 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there was anxiety over many of the issues that define immigration today. The convergence of immigration and the fear of terror, for example. There was huge anxiety over communism, the Eastern European Jews bringing communist ideas to the United States. There was huge anxieties over anarchism, the Italians and the Eastern Europeans bringing anarchistic beliefs to our country. So this has been a constant. It is always activated in how we narrate the story of the nation that immigrants contributed in the past, but today they're different. Today they're not going to assimilate. Today they're not going to become part of the family. And what we've discovered in the last 150 years is just how wrong those predictions have been. Over time in our country, immigrants have tended to become increasingly integrated. If you look at the data on language acquisition, very hard, but the movement is in the right direction. By the second generation, most Hispanics in the United States have lost their Spanish and have moved fully and with a vengeance into English. By the second generation, most Chinese children cannot say good morning to their grandmother in Fujianese or in Taiwanese or in Cantonese. They can't. Our country, one of my colleagues at Harvard put it very well, is a cemetery for languages. The Dutch brought Dutch to Michigan, and in the third generation, it's a language that has been buried. The Germans brought German. German has been buried in the United States. The Italians brought Italian. So the anxieties about immigration, whether it's language, whether it's culture, whether it's identity, whether it's security, whether it's the economy, over time tend to dissipate and find new scapegoats on the new arrival. But I can't talk about the political class because I've given up on understanding that.
Well, that was a very clear answer. Thank you.
How are you doing today? Thanks for having us. I'd like to thank Professor DeVivo and Professor Lay for having our class come hear your great speech. I have a question regarding assimilation and Americanization. Will immigrants in 2050 face a different form of assimilation and Americanization because of the rise of the Latino population?
I didn't get the last part of your question.
I'm wondering if in the year 2050, will newly arrived immigrants face a different form of assimilation and Americanization because of the rising Latino population?
Yeah, I think that, and I'll link it to my last answer, that when our colleagues at the U.S. Bureau of the Census make these very nice pie charts that show in the year 2050 half of the U.S. population will be members of ethnically marked groups, about a quarter, over 100 million people are going to be Hispanics, then the Asian origin population of the United States will continue to grow at a very, very fast rate. The African American origin population of the United States will remain pretty stable, but the fantastic reality there is that a larger and larger share of the African American population of our country is now immigrant origin. Half of all blacks in New York City now are immigrant blacks. In fact, over the last generation, 20 years, twice as many blacks arrived in our country as free migrants, twice as many as during the entire Mid-Atlantic Passage during slavery. So no piece of the American narrative will be unaffected by large-scale immigration. But moving forward and predicting what will the United States look like in the year 2050 becomes very, very risky. There's a thin line here between science and science fiction. When you're modeling the behavior of people that haven't even been born yet, you're playing a difficult game. In the United States, over the last 150 years, the fundamental dynamic has been one of increasing integration and increasing outmarriage. If you look at the rates of people marrying outside their group, Asian Americans lead the way. In the second and third generation, the rates of people marrying outside their group grow exponentially. This is true for Asian Americans, this is true for Caribbeans, Latino Caribbeans, and this is true for South Americans and Latin Americans. So the American narrative has been one of, yes, there are these concerns over segregation, yes, there are these concerns over separation in the first generation. Over time and across generations, there is a movement towards intermarriage, towards integration, towards really the transculturation that has given our culture its unique character, its unique vigor, its unique sensibilities. So in the long term, I think it's very, very difficult to say 25% of the U.S. population will be Latinos, when most of those Latino children will probably be the children of interethnic marriages.
Thank you very much, sir.
Hello. I was just thinking that I think part of the fear of immigration is that people are upset that when immigrants move in, they can take advantage of like public schools and emergency care because they don't pay taxes. I think people are afraid that they're getting all these services for free. So why can't we just make it extremely easy for them to get a Social Security number and then all their taxes get taken out of their work checks just like most Americans?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. Today is the New York Times day because I had an earlier conversation. This was a front-page story, by the way. Social Security Administration discovered there are $5 billion in unclaimed funds. These are funds that are filed into the system, but nobody's claiming them. So this led to a very interesting question because, of course, if you've taken Economics 101, human beings are rational choice actors. They're highly motivated to get back what they've paid into the system. So the question is, where exactly does this money come from? The best hypothesis is that this money comes from undocumented workers in the labor force today who are paying into the system, yet they're not getting back any of their investment through the Social Security Administration. It is estimated that there are probably between 5 and 7 million workers in the U.S. labor force today without papers. So if you do the quick math, you're probably getting about $1 billion in surplus Social Security Administration monies for every million undocumented workers in the labor force. This is, of course, all subterranean. This is all in the shadows. There's no way to address this issue because of the elephant in the room. We have 12 million people in our country that don't have any papers. And this is generating immense difficulties, immense challenges for local communities, for local governance issues that are struggling with a dystopic, dysfunctional system where, in our Constitution, the domain of immigration is the domain of the federal authorities, not local governments. As long as we have this disconnect between the realities in the field and our inability as a country to come up with a rational, coherent, workable, humane policy, we're going to have these kinds of anxieties, these kinds of prejudices, these kinds of tensions. It is simply, I think we're reaching a tipping point. At one point, can a democracy continue to function when a third of our immigrant population now, a third, has no papers? 2 million children have no papers. These are children that are going to wake up tomorrow in Grand Rapids and are going to go to school. These are children who really only know the United States as their country, because they were brought here as babies in many, many cases. So we have to ask these fundamental questions. Unfortunately, the political class was unable to reach a consensus. We saw two efforts by the Senate and the White House that imploded over the last year. At the moment, I'm not at all optimistic. I don't think there is a political will to really rationally address the issue. So we're going to have more dystopic, dysfunctional interventions that in the long term create more problems than will solve.
At the risk of raising political climate in the current Senate and the No Child Left Behind debate, have you been asked to provide information for its revision? And if not, that's sad, but if so, what would be and what is your best recommendations for the No Child Left Behind?
We just got an op-ed accepted to the New York Times, so if you read the New York Times, you'll see what we have to say about No Child Left Behind. And Senator Lugar and George Miller invited us to a retreat where we spent considerable amount of time thinking and sharing with senators. This is a bipartisan committee of the Senate and the Congress. To make a long story short, I believe in standards and in accountability. I don't believe in punitive, mechanical testing. I think that our educational system is facing serious problems when the tests drive everything else. There is a role in testing, so don't get me wrong, but testing needs to be part of a much, much more integrated and coherent strategy. Unfortunately, many schools today in our country, because of No Child Left Behind, testing has really become the end of education, the purpose of education. And I think this is a very, very serious problem. In part, and this is a topic of another book that we just released with the University of California Press called Learning in the Global Era, a different book, that addresses this basic question of how do we educate children for the 21st century? You don't educate children for the 21st century to develop the kinds of cognitive agilities and sensibilities that are going to be required of them by testing them to death. When it comes to immigrant origin children, I think that the data are overwhelming. If you look at the National Report Card on Reading and Math, the results for the English language learners are devastating. 70% of the 8th graders are performing in these tests at below basic, 70%. I think 0% of the 8th graders in math and in reading are performing at the excellent level. What this tells me is that immigrant origin children that are English language learners, without the systematic language and literacy supports that are needed to ease their transition into disciplinary engagement, so they can learn real mathematics, they can learn real science, are being cheated. And the testing then becomes a punitive ritual that simply tells them what everybody knows, which is performing at a level which requires academic competence, not conversational competence, is much, much more difficult. And the unfortunate consequence of this is that very large numbers of children check themselves out of schooling and of engagement. So a lot of kids that, with patience, a lot of kids that, with systematic nurturing, would remain engaged in the system, increasingly are detaching themselves and disconnecting because the data, the feedback they get, is so consistently and overwhelmingly negative. So I think that, for example, the administration is proposing to start testing children systematically in their 3rd year in the United States. We need to have a real debate as to what are the tests, what do the tests reveal, and what are the skills that these tests are actually measuring. The status quo today is large numbers of children will check themselves out of education, will disconnect, will become disengaged, at a time when the U.S. opportunity structure is really not generating a meaningful space that will promise them status mobility. Now remember, their parents came to do jobs Americans don't want to take. The children are very, very different, come from a very different set of expectations. They're American children. They have much, much higher expectations than their children. This is the formula for huge frustration and failure moving forward.
Anishna, Shkadanskoy Nadizhnikaz, Nadosepi Huron Bodowadami, Mashikan Dodam, and Washtamangadawa. I introduce myself that way as taught by my elders. And I'd like to thank you for coming here and giving us and presenting us with many challenges and many thoughts. As an indigenous person here, and one that I take great pride in educating, the non-indigenous community members as well as students. It is clear to me that by not treasuring your culture, by not preserving your language, and the effects of assimilation, have had disastrous results with my people. We have the highest teenage suicide rate in the nation of all suicide rates of students. We have the highest dropout rate as well. So our indigenous children are the ones that are checking out. And I feel that part of it is because of the forced assimilation. I would like to know what discussions you and your colleagues have had regarding the preservation of the original language of the students, as well as the culture of the original, their original culture that they come from, and how can all of that be a place here as well?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. Again, it's a question that I can only very superficially engage because it's a profound observation and reflection. Let me be very, very clear. I believe that in the 21st century, every child, native, immigrant, majority white European origin child, should have multilingual competencies. I believe that The fact that our country is, as one of my colleagues said, a cemetery for languages is a shame, and it's dysfunctional in the context of the global economies and societies of the 21st century. So I believe that it is in our national interest to preserve languages for multiple reasons, some of which have to do with fundamental matters of identity and belonging. Some of them have to do with empirically derived, very carefully constructed experiments that suggest that your ability to function in your own language is a very, very good predictor of your ability to learn a second language at a much higher level of literacy. So it is when you have a good foundation in your home language that you're able to learn and acquire a second language at a much, much more sophisticated level of acquisition. Furthermore, I think that we are continuing to face the catastrophic loss of world languages. A language, as Wittgenstein first argued, captures a world. It captures a way of constructing and relating to the reality of the natural, the social, and the cultural environment. Every day a language disappears, and languages disappear every week today. A world is lost, a sensibility, a basic fundamental way of apprehending, of constructing, of engaging the world disappears. The claims that can be made for supporting multilingualism are simply too fundamental as to almost make them banal. From science to culture to security. Read the Iraq report. How many of our personnel in Iraq can function in Arabic? This is a scandal. We don't have the personnel to fundamentally do the job in a foreign language. So, almost regardless of domain, your ability to engage the world in more than one language will, moving forward, have more rather than less relevance and weight in human engagement. Every child, immigrant and non-immigrant alike, should be able to speak more than one language. We owe it to the children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suarez Orozco. We will be having a book signing for those of you who may be interested in purchasing a book tonight. So thank you all for coming. And again, please take a moment to fill out your evaluation. And take your program. Our next lecture will be Wednesday, November 14th. So thank you very much.
Thank you.